Hello, I'm Nancy Strickland from IT Mentors. This video on web forms is part of a series on the Beta 2 release of Visual Studio 2010 and the .NET Framework 4. In this video, I'll talk about what's new in Web Forms 4.0. Here are the topics, new features, or improvements that will make your job easier and give you more control over your applications. The new features are Client ID, View State Mode, routing and query extenders, and there are also some enhancements to existing controls. Up until now, client IDs were potentially problems in ASP.NET. Client scripts that want to reference elements that are rendered on a page use the ID attribute of the element to do that. For elements that you create yourself in code, you assign that ID. But when a server control generates an element, like maybe a repeating control, then it generates the client ID itself using an algorithm to make sure that it's a unique ID. And it can look something like this one at the top, because the algorithm for generating IDs involves concatenating the naming container, which acts like a namespace for controls, because it ensures that its child controls names are unique on the page. And then sometimes it adds a prefix and a sequential number, and basically IDs can get pretty complex. Now you can access the client ID from a read-only property of the control that's called client ID. So you can use that in client-side scripts. But you don't know what the client-side ID is until runtime. And if you modify the page, like you add or remove controls dynamically, then a whole new client-side ID might be generated. And all that has made it harder to use client IDs in scripts up until now. And now, in ASP.NET 4.0, there's a new property that controls how those client IDs are generated. The property is named Client ID Mode, and it has 4 possible values. Auto ID says to generate the ID with the same algorithm as before. Static means generate the ID without concatenating the ID for parent container. That's particularly useful for web user controls that might be located in different containers, maybe on different pages. So the name of the control would change from one place to another. So using static means that the name of the control will be the same. Predictable is used when a data control uses a repeating template. It concatenates the idea of the control's naming container, but instead of a string like CTL01, like we have up there at the top, it uses the name of a data field. Usually that's the primary key of a data record as the suffix. And it gets that name from whatever you set as the client ID row suffix property. So you can control how that's formed in a repeating template. And then inherit, the inherit setting means that this control's way of generating an ID is the same as its parent. And that's the default behavior. You can set the client ID mode property at the page level, and because inheritance is the default, then that defines the default client ID mode for all the controls on that page. Pages default to auto ID, so if you never explicitly set the client mode anywhere, then everything's going to behave just the way it always has. But if you want to change it, here's what setting the page level value using the at page looks like. So you can see you just set that property to whatever you want it to, predictable in this case. You can also set the client ID mode in the configuration file, either at the machine level or at the application level. If you set it at the application level, then you're defining the default client ID mode setting for all controls in all pages in the application. If you set the value at the machine level, it defines the default client ID mode setting for all websites on that computer. And here's what that looks like. I'm going to show you an example of static mode. That means that whatever value you put in for the ID is what's going to be used for the client-side ID. You won't get one generated for you. Now, of course, that means that you, the developer, will have to make sure that the IDs are unique yourself. I've opened an application here. It has 2 text boxes. One's ID is text echo 2, and the other one is text box 1. The difference, of course, is that the second one here has its client ID mode set to static. The other one here, which doesn't have anything, is using the default, which is auto ID. Now I'm going to run it. And I'm going to select from the menu here, Page, and View Source, so that we can see how it was rendered. Let me scroll down here. And here it is. That's a little hard to read. Let me see if I can make it a little bit bigger here. There, now you can probably see that a little better. The first one rendered here with a server-generated ID. And the second one, the one that we set to static mode, didn't. It used the ID that I provided for it. By default, view state is enabled for a whole page, which means that every control on the page stores its view state, even if the application doesn't need it, isn't going to use it. And that means that at least potentially a lot of unneeded state information gets sent back and forth to the server, which is obviously a potential performance problem and a bandwidth problem. Before version 4.0, developers could disable view state for any individual control. But now in ASP.NET 4, there's another property that works the opposite way. It lets you disable view state by default and then go back and enable it only for the controls that require it on a particular page. The view state mode property has three possible values. It can be enabled, and that enables view state for that control and its child controls, unless they're explicitly set to disabled. And this is the default value at the page level. Then disabled, obviously that disables view state. And inherit means that the state of the particular control that it's applied to is the same as its parent control. Inherit is the default value of the view state mode. So by default, all controls on a page are going to save their view state. You can set the view state mode for the page like this. You can see here that this last property says view state mode equals disabled. So that means that you can disable view state at the page level and then selectively enable it for particular controls on the page. And you'll want to do that whenever that's easier than the opposite approach, which is selectively disabling. Now, a good example of that, when it might be better, is with the content placeholder control in a master page, because you could set view state mode to disabled for the master page and then enable it individually for content placeholder controls that have controls where you want to save the view state. And one warning, the value of the view state mode property only works if enable view state property is set to true. If it's set to false, like in this example here where I'm setting at the page level, then it doesn't matter how you set the view state mode. State isn't ever going to be preserved. Okay, I've opened up a little ASP.NET app here that has some view state mode settings. Let's look at them. I've got a placeholder here, and the view state mode on it has been disabled. And so inside it says disabled, and then there's a label, and that label doesn't have a view state mode set, so it's inheriting the view state mode of its containing parent here, so it's disabled also. And notice that the text in it says declared value. Then there's a second placeholder here that's nested inside the first one, and it explicitly sets its view state mode back to enabled, so it's overriding that. It has a label inside it also that again does not have its own view state mode, so it inherits enabled as well. So this label is going to be enabled for view state mode to preserve view state mode, and this label is not. Now, when the page is first loaded right here, our onload event says if it's the first time the page is loading, then we're going to set both of those texts in label 1 and label 2 to dynamic value. So the first time through, this declared value is not what it'll show. It'll be a dynamic value. But there's also a button here button labeled Postback, and when I click that, that will make a round trip to the server, and at that point the state will be preserved only for this second label, the one that has its view state enabled. So after Postback, I should see the new value, the preserved state, in the second one. That's the dynamic value. And in the first one, it will get the declared value that it gets client side. Because, of course, the second time, the Postback, this is not going to run again. So let me run it so you can see what happens. Okay, so here's our first time through, and you can see that both the disabled label and the enabled label both got their dynamic values. But now I'm going to click Postback. And you can see that after the Postback, the one that was enabled had its dynamic value preserved, and the one that didn't just got its client-side value, the declared value. ASP.NET 4 has added built-in support for using routing with web forms. Routing lets you configure your application to accept request URLs that don't map to physical files. Instead, you use routing to define URLs that are meaningful, easier for users, and also helpful if you're doing search engine optimization for your application. So, for example, here, the first example, a page that displays product categories could have a URL like this if it uses a physical file path. But if you use routing, you can use a kind of a pseudo path for your URL that's easier to understand and remember. So the second example shows just website, products, software. Routing has actually been available since ASP.NET 3.5 in Service Pack 1, and now 4.0 continues that and has some new features that make it easier to use. There's the page route handler class, which is a simple HTTP handler that you use when you define routes. It passes data to the page that the request is being routed to. And then there's some new properties, HTTP request context, and page route data. Page route data is a proxy for HTTP request context route data, and those make it easier to access information that's being passed in from the route. There's also some new expression builders, route URL, that creates a URL that corresponds to a route URL format in an ASP.NET Server control, and then route value lets you get information from the route context object. And then the route parameter class passes data that's contained in a route context object to a query for a data source control. So here's how you define a web forms route with the map page route method, which is new to Beta 2. In the first example, you can see that inside my application start method, I have added a couple of routings to my routing table. So the search route is the name of it, and you can see that if the path says search / and then has some search term in it, that it will be routed to /search.aspx. And then there's another route, the user route, and if the URL that comes in is users / some username, then I'll route it to users.aspx. And then in the second example, I'm doing it with a page route handler. Again, I'm adding to my routing table a new route. It is search term. I'm only showing the one here of the two, and I just instantiate it as a new page route handler that routes it to search ASPX. Now, either way, in either case, we're mapping a route, which is a kind of user-friendly path, sort of, to a physical path to a physical page, search ASPX. The route will be search / and a search term, and then because that search term is in braces, it'll be extracted from the URL and passed on to the page. There are several overloads to these methods, and there's some considerations related to security, so you'll want to look at the documentation for this to see what all your options are. If you want to use the routing information in code, there are some new properties that help you do that. Here's an example of using the new page route data property. You can see that it can look at that route, extract the search term, values is a dictionary there, and I can extract the search term and then assign it to a string and do whatever I want with it. Here I'm putting it into a label. So if you look at this example down here, if the user types in localhost/search/Scott, then the word Scott is rendered in the search ASPX page, and here the code would assign it to label1.txt. In this demo, we're going to take an existing ASP.NET website and add routing to it. That'll make it easier for users to access pages with user-friendly names, and it'll also simplify site maintenance. The existing app has 2 pages, and one has a link to the other. I'm going to run it so you can see what it does. You can see that it's just the ASP.NET default app, and I've added a link here that's going to open a greetings page. And there it is. Now let me go to the source code so that you can see that what I have is a regular ASP.NET hyperlink that's linked to the new page.aspx, which is located in a subfolder called My Pages. Here it is over here in the Solution Explorer. So right now the URL is a physical path with a folder name and a file name. And when I click the link, it navigates the site to get to that physical location. Now, of course, I can also type the path to the page that I want directly into the address bar. I'm going to run it again and do that. I'll just go up here to the top, and I'm going to replace default ASPX with the path to the file that I want, the page that I want. Well, let me try spelling it right. See if that helps any. And there it is. It worked, but to do it, I had to know the physical path, which in this case wasn't very long, but it can sometimes be very long and complex. So it's error-prone, and it's not friendly for the average user. Well, really, it's not friendly for any user. Now we're going to change this app so that it can take advantage of routing. I'm going to use Visual Basic for this demo since the slides showed you the C# code. So first I'm going to open the global ASAX file here. And the first thing I'll do is import the namespace that I need. Whoops. And that's System Web Routing. And then I want to add code to add to the route table using the route collection map page route method. The name of the method I'm adding here, the sub, is called register routes. And you can see that my IntelliSense is popping up, so the import of the routing namespace seems to be working. And the actual code is pretty simple. The name of the route here is going to be hello route. That's the first parameter. And then the URL pattern, this says look for a URL pattern that contains the literal value greeting. And then the last is the path, the actual physical path. So what this method says is, if you see a URL with greeting in it, direct it to the physical page that's in the My Pages folder called newpage.aspx. And now down here in the application start, I'm going to run that. So when I call this method with this argument, it adds my routes to the site by adding them to the routes property, which is a static property of the route table class. Now I'm finished. I've actually added routing to the site now. So you can see it's pretty easy, and adding it has several advantages. The first one I'm going to show you is that it makes your site more user-friendly. Let me save this and run it. Now say I'm a user who wants to go directly to that greetings page. So I'm going to type the URL in the bar, but this time I don't have to type the whole physical path. I don't have to know the physical path. It might be, several layers deep in a hierarchy of folders. But now I only have to know the route, which is, sort of a friendly name, greeting. I just replaced default ASPX with greeting. And look, it did the navigation for me. Very user-friendly. Now I'm going to change my URL, the hyperlink, to also use my routing. And we'll run it again just to check, make sure everything's okay. And there we go. Used the hyperlink and did exactly what it was supposed to. What's the advantage to using routing and hyperlinks? Well, there's a couple. One is, of course, that the link is just simply easier to write here. I'm not writing anything long here, just the same way the user didn't have to write anything long and complicated. So it's less error prone. But routes and hyperlinks can also make maintaining your site easier. So to demonstrate that, I'm going to go over here and move New Page ASPX out of My Pages. We'll just put it right here on the at the highest level here in the hierarchy. Now, of course, that's going to break my app. I'm going to run it again here. And when I try to click on Greetings, you'll see my error message, resource cannot be found. Well, it's not very unusual to have to move a page or change the directory structure of a site, but there can be many hyperlinks to one page that are located in other pages all over a site. And so when you move your pages or you change your directory structure, then you'd have to find and change all those other pages that have hyperlinks in them, and that's a big job. But using routing, I'm not going to have to find and change them all because I don't have to edit the hyperlink itself to fix the problem. If I've got a routing in Global ASAX, I can just change it to point to the new physical site, and then all the hyperlinks that use routing in all the pages are now pointing to the new site without having to be changed. So I'm going to go back into my Global ASAX and just change my routing here. That's simple. Now I'll run it again. And there you go. I fixed the hyperlink without touching the hyperlink itself. And that's handy if you've got lots of different places where that hyperlink might be. Okay, so that's the basic functionality. You can also pass an argument to the route and access it in code and do things with it, but that's a whole new topic and it's kind of long, although it's not terribly hard. So I'm not going to cover it here. The MSDN documentation for ASP.NET 4 covers it completely, and it has a nice walkthrough, so I'm going to recommend that to you. And I've put a link to it on the resources slide that I'm going to show at the end of this video. A lot of the time, maybe most of the time, when your app retrieves data to display, it's not going to retrieve or display all the data from a query. It's going to filter it with a where clause to get only the data that meets some criteria, maybe from a user input or something. ASP.NET 4 has a new control. It's called a query extender, and that is used to make it easier and more efficient to do those kinds of filters. You can add it to entity data source or to link data source controls to filter the data that the control returns. Now, since it's relying on link, the filter gets applied on the database server before the data is sent back to the page, so it's more efficient and it reduces your network traffic. Here's an example of using a query extender control that uses the text from the text box search control to search the product name and supplier company name fields of data that's returned from the link data source control. And you can see that it's doing a starts with search. There are several other filtering options besides search. You can filter on range and property, and you can also define a custom filter with a function. And you can include multiple expressions in your filter. For examples and descriptions of those, I'm going to refer you to the documentation of the query extender on MSDN. I've got a link to it in the resources at the end of this video. The idea of a query extender control is to filter the data that's retrieved from a data source, and it has the advantage that you can use it in markup to filter data using only declarative syntax. So this demo doesn't really have any coding, just some drag and drop designing and some markup. What we're going to do is select values from the products table in the AdventureWorks sample database. This is based on a walkthrough on MSDN that I'll mention again later at the end of the demo. Now, I've already got Visual Studio 2010 Beta 2 open, and it's open to an existing project that includes the AdventureWorks database. Here it is over here under my App Data folder. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a data model using Link to SQL. So I'm going to right-click here and select Add New Item. And what I want, when it comes up here, is Link to SQL. There it is right there. Now by default you can see it's called Data Classes. I think I might call it AdventureWorks. You'll see where this comes up again in a minute. Now when I say Add, it's going to ask me if I want to put it into the app code folder. You see I don't have an app code folder yet, but when I say yes, it's going to create it for me and put the new item in it. So I'll say yes. Okay, so it's done that. It's created the app code folder and put this in it. And what I'm looking at here, the window it's opened, is called the Object Relational Designer. It's a graphic user interface that I can use with my database. So I'm going to go over here and open my Server Explorer. Go ahead and pin it here. Open my AdventureWorks database. Go to Tables. And I said we were going to use the product table, so I'm going to take the product table and just drag it over here. And now I can go ahead and unpin Server Explorer. I'm finished with that. And you can see that what it gives me is a nice visual representation of my table displayed as an entity with properties. Okay, that's done. So I'm going to my web page here, and I'm going to click down here to the tabs down here to click to the design view, because I'm going to do a little drag and drop editing. Let me open my toolbox here, and I've got my data tools open. What I want to do is add a data source control to the page and then configure it to work with the database. Now I can either use my link data source or an entity data source. Both of those can work with the query extender control. I'm going to use a link data source control. I'll drag it over here and put it on my form. Now it's not going to actually show up on the page. It won't be visible to the user, and neither will the query extender control, by the way, when we get to that in just a minute here. I am going to delete some of this extra content here. I'll go ahead and leave Welcome to ASP.NET. Now notice that when I point to this control, or when I click on it, when I select it, I get a little smart tag that pops up here. And it shows me when I click on it the tasks that I need to do with this control. I'm going to select Configure Data Source. Little wizard comes up. I want to make sure that Show Only here is checked because that will show me only data context objects. And in the drop down I want to select my AdventureWorks data context, and the reason it's called AdventureWorks is because when I created my data model I did make sure to say AdventureWorks there, changed it from data classes to AdventureWorks. Okay, next. And now I have a choice of tables here. Now I wouldn't have this if I hadn't built my my application just a minute ago, so you want to be sure to compile before you get to this point. And there's only one table that I selected, so that's the table I want. I'm not going to group by. Here's my choices, but I'm not going to group by anything. You can see that this asterisk is pre-selected, and what that means is that all columns will be selected, but I really don't want all of them. I'll just select ID, name, and color. And I'm fixed up. Finish. Now while I still have my link data source selected, I want to go over to the Properties window and check the context type. That looks right. The context type name is AdventureWorks Data Context. That's what I wanted. And now I'm ready to add my filtering control, my query extender. So I'm going to drag that onto my page also. And then while I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and also drag a grid view object, and that grid view object is what I'm going to use to display the result of the search. Those are both in the data section, right? So I got my link data source, and I got my query extender, and I got my grid view from here. While I've got the toolbox open, let me go to the standard area and put a couple of other things in. I want a text box, and that's where the user is going to type the search criteria into. And then I want a button that I'll click to start the search. And I'll put that there, and I'll rename that button, or rather, put some text on it, search. Okay, now I've got a text box, a search button. Both of those are going to show, and the grid control is going to show to the user. And then this link data source and the query extender are not. I also need to set some properties here for the grid view. So I'm going to select it, and we need a data source. This data source ID, and you can see that it's a drop down because there's a limited number of data sources available. Here's the one we're going to use. It's the only one, in fact, link data source 1. And then I need to tell it what the data key names are, and again there's only one in this case. It's product ID because there's only one key, one table. Now I'm going to select my query extender here, and I want to set its target control ID, oops, right there, also to link data source 1. And save what I've done so far because I'm about to switch to my source code view for a while. You can see what's been done so far. So you can see my query extender here. It's named and run its server, and it's got its target control ID that I set. And then the grid views down here. And then my link data source is right here. And you can see that in it, it's got the equivalent of the query. It says that I'm using the AdventureWorks data context, that I want to select product ID, name, and color from the table, from the products table. Now what I need to do is add some things to my query extender. Now, like the name says, the query extender extends your query. Right now, I'm only selecting product ID, name, and color, all of them. And what I want to do is put in sort of the equivalent of a where clause here. And to do that, I add an ASP.NET search expression. There it is. And IntelliSense will help me here. If I press the space, I can see that I can add a comparison type. In other words, is this an equals or a greater than? What kind of comparison is it? I can add data fields to say where to search. I'll do that. I'm going to search the name column, the name field. And then I can give it a search type. And you can see that this is an enumeration, so I can say if the field contains or ends with or starts with. I'm going to use starts with here. And then inside that, there's one other thing I need, and IntelliSense knows what it is. It's a control parameter. The control parameter says, where am I getting this information that to compare to? So I'm going to put in here where to get the information for the search. In other words, where am I going to get the data from to search against the name for starts with? So now the search expression is going to search the name column for products that start with the string that's entered in the text box control. And now we can test the search filter. I see one little problem here, like that equals. There we go. Got rid of my problem. Okay, so now we're ready to test my search filter. Let me save everything first and then run my app. Web debugging, or debugging is disabled by default, so I'm going to say enable it for me. And there it is. It's showing everything now. That might be something we'd want to change, but in this case it does make it easy for me to find something to search for. I can see that there's several here things that start with long, so I'm going to type in LO, and notice that I'm deliberately typing in lowercase just to show you, and there's my result. So that's a little introduction to this new query extender control. You can do more with it. You can filter in other ways, like I said in the slides. So to get more information on that, I'm going to refer you to the MSDN walkthroughs on ASP.NET, which have longer and more detailed examples. Besides the new things we just saw, there are also several improvements to existing control. Grid View and List View now support persisted selection. Menu now renders differently, and List View no longer requires a lookup template. So let's look quickly at each of these. The Grid View and List View controls can let users select a row. In previous versions of ASP.NET, that selection was based on the row index on the page. So if a user selected the third item on page 1 and then moved to page 2, the third item on that page was selected. Now, this was seldom what the user intended or expected. So now, when persisted selection is enabled, then the current selected item will be based on the data key for that item instead of the row. So if you select the third row on page 1 and then you move to page 2, nothing is selected on page 2. But then when you move back to page 1, the third row is still selected. That's a more natural and expected behavior. To enable it, you just have to set the Enable Persisted Selection property like it shows here. The menu control has changed how it renders in ASP.NET 4. Instead of a table, it renders as a bulleted list, and that makes it easier to apply styles to. And it also has some built-in accessibility enhancements like cursor key navigation. Here's the ASP.NET code for it at the top here, and then at the bottom you can see how it's going to render. The List View control has been made easier to use in ASP.NET 4 because it doesn't require a layout template anymore. The top example here is how it worked before 4.0, and you can see that you had to add that layout template. And then the second example below shows how much shorter and easier it is to write now that you don't have to have your layout template. Okay, and here are some more resources you can use to learn more about new managed language features in Visual Studio 2010 and .NET 4.0. This first URL is the home page for Visual Studio on MSDN. So it has a link to the download site for Visual Studio, which is now in Beta 2, and it's also got links to documentation and to other help. The next link is to the training kit, although you'll probably just want to do a search for it instead of trying to get something like that in. It includes some hands-on labs for new features, including some of the ones that we just talked about. And then here's a link to What's New in ASP.NET 4 on MSDN, which has more information about all the topics I've covered and a few others too. The source code for my demos from this video and others are posted on my blog, which is shown here at the top. I'm also announcing on Twitter when I post new videos, so if you'd like to know what's available and when it becomes available, you can follow me on Twitter at nstrickland1. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.